Oh, that God would bless us with forgetfulness about many words spoken about us and about our ministry and about our spouses and about our children. Words of the wind. And I think Eliphaz doesn't understand that. Eliphaz is upset and he says, now it has come to you and you're impatient. Because he just heard these words in chapter 3 about, I wish I weren't born. I think they should have said, let's give him a few days to think about that. Or a few months maybe. You don't need to start preaching to this guy because he blurted out some wish I hadn't been born sentence.
I think we've all had moments where we said something we really didn't mean. We just blurted it out in the middle of our pain. And sometimes the worst part is how quickly people can jump in to try to fix it. I'm Dan Kruver. In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper looks at Job's friends and helps us think more carefully about what suffering people actually need. This message was originally delivered at The Cove in Asheville, North Carolina on July 15th, 2000.
And now comes 29 chapters of too much talk. Now there's an order to these chapters. And I'll just point it out. It does have a significance, and I'll show you a little bit of it. There are 3 cycles of speeches. Eliphaz speaks, Job answers. Bildad speaks, Job answers. Zophar speaks, Job answers. That's cycle 1, chapters 4 through 14. Cycle 2, Eliphaz speaks, Job answers. Bildad speaks, Job answers. Zophar speaks, Job answers. That's cycle 2, chapters 15 through 21. Then there's a 3rd cycle. What's happening is that the speeches are getting shorter because these guys are running out of things to say. Eliphaz speaks, chapter 22, Job answers. Bildad speaks, Job answers. Zophar has nothing to say. There's a reason for why that cycle breaks at the end. It breaks. Bildad's last speech is 6 verses long, a little teeny speech, and Zophar has no more to say. And Job gets the last word. Then comes, now we'll move into this later this evening, but then comes a young man named Elihu in chapters 32 to 37, and he speaks, and then the Lord speaks. 39 to 41, the Lord settles the matter, and then you get a closing chapter of the reversal, finally, and the restoration of His blessing. So that's the order of the book. These 29 chapters, 3 cycles of speeches between Job and his three friends. And our question now is, why all these speeches? Why all this talk? Well, let's walk through it. I think we can do this in the time we have. Chapter 3 is the explosion of Job's pent-up frustration with God's drawing out this suffering longer than he had hoped. And he finally just gives in and curses the day he was born. Verses 1 to 3, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, let the day perish wherein I was born. Then verse 11, chapter 3, why did I not die at birth? Come forth from the womb and expire. Why did the knees receive me? Why the breasts that I should suck? Then verse 20, look at verse 20, chapter 3. Why is the light given to him that is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it comes not? So Job just can't see any reason for this. It's dragging on. And he says, look, if it's like this, if this is the way life is going to be, there was no reason for me to be born except to be tormented. I'm not getting it. And his faith is beginning to waver here, but not give up. And they do not like, these friends do not like what Job is saying. And here they're losing their pastoral sense of timing. They're very upset with Job, and they begin to respond. They begin to respond gently with their theology, and then they become brutal with their theology as Job keeps protesting. So let's watch them as they go. There's a principle of justice that's going to emerge here that they're going to assert over and over and over again till they can assert it no more. And we need to see what that is. Let's go to chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, and we'll see it there. Chapter 4, verse 7. Eliphaz speaking. Think now, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. So there's the principle. Trouble comes because of sin. And prosperity by implication comes because of righteousness. Now, Eliphaz states the principle. Pain is a correlation to sin. Now, he's not insensitive to a few other realities. Number one, we're all sinners. Verse 17 of chapter 4. Can mortal man be righteous before God? Can a man be pure before his Maker? Now that's a question that expects the answer no. So Eliphaz knows we're all sinners. However, he does hold to the principle that extraordinary sin will bring extraordinary suffering. However, he has another softening point in his theology, and it's also true, namely that some suffering is chastisement for the good of God's people. I see that in verse 17 of chapter 5. 17 of 5. Behold, happy is the man whom God reproves. Therefore despise not the chastening of the Almighty. So, in a sense, you can hardly fault the theology of Eliphaz here. There is real sin because of suffering, and there is real chastening for our good, and we all do sin, and so you can't always correlate sin and suffering perfectly. So Eliphaz his first speech is not harsh. It's got some balance to it. But when he comes to application to Job, he proves himself to be insensitive and superficial. Those are my two problems with Eliphaz as he begins. Insensitive and superficial. Let's look at why I say that. Chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Here's the impatient part, I think. He says, but now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. So he's criticizing Job because Job cries out because he wishes he couldn't be born. Now it's been some time has elapsed here. At least 7 days, probably longer, has elapsed, and Job blurts out some words. You know, I didn't write down the text, but somewhere along in chapter 5 or 6, I think in Job's response, there's a statement about words for the wind. Why do you fault a man because of words for the wind? I don't know where it is. I'll find it and give it to you later. But this is so important in a church. This is important for pastors. This is important for husbands and wives and parents. In life, both in pain and other times, usually it comes to anger, words are spoken that you should just let be words for the wind. Let the wind blow them away. Don't write them down. Don't bring them back up. Let them go. That was spoken. She didn't mean that. Don't hold her to that. The kid didn't mean it. He loves you. It was a word for the wind. Let it go. If you can't let words go in a church, you're going to die in a church. Many words are spoken in a church that should be blown away by the soonest wind that comes along. Nobody writes them down. Nobody keeps an account. If you keep an account of word wrongs in your ministry or your life, you will become one embittered, small, angry person, doing nobody any good. Oh, that God would bless us with forgetfulness about many words spoken about us and about our ministry and about our spouses and about our children. Words of the wind. And I think Eliphaz doesn't understand that. Eliphaz is upset and he says, now it has come to you and you're impatient. Because he just heard these words in chapter 3 about, I wish I weren't born. I think they should have said, let's give him a few days to think about that, or a few months maybe. You don't need to start preaching to this guy because he blurted out some wish I hadn't been born sentence. Chapter 5, verse 8. Job had said, as for me, Eliphaz, as for me, I would seek God, and to God would I commit my cause. Now that's what I regard as the insinuation of superficiality here. It says, if I were in your shoes, I would commit my cause to God. Look at verse 18 of chapter 5. He wounds, God wounds, but He binds up. He smites, but His hands heal. He'll deliver you from 6 troubles, and in 7 there shall no evil touch you. It's going to turn around. But he's criticizing him that he doesn't embrace this. And I think he's doing it too simply, too quickly, too superficially. That's my problem with Eliphaz in his first speech. Job protests, chapter 6, his innocence. Verse 10, chapter 6. I have not denied the words of the Holy One. In other words, you say this is coming because of sin, Eliphaz. I haven't denied His words. He's still the Holy One in my life. Chapter 6, verse 24. Teach me and I'll be silent. Make me understand how I've erred. He's protesting. He's saying, okay, you got this principle of justice that says this suffering correlates with big sin. Show me where I've sinned. Show me where I've erred. So that's his response to Eliphaz. Now let's let Bildad say the principle. He's less gentle than Eliphaz, and it's going to get less gentle as we go along. We're in chapter 8 now, verses 3 and 4. Does God pervert justice? This is Bildad talking. Does God pervert justice? Or does the Almighty pervert the right? Now watch what he does. This really hurts. This really hurts because he's going to talk about his children. They're dead. If your children have sinned against Him, He has delivered them into the power of their transgression. So here he takes this principle and he applies it with such pastoral cruelty to a man who's suffering. When you don't know what those kids were experiencing. You don't know. He doesn't know what the situation was. He doesn't understand the freedom and sovereignty of God. And so he takes this little principle of big sin, big suffering, big righteousness, big prosperity. He applies it to these 10 kids, to the dad who is suffering. And he says, they committed some huge transgression. That's why this house fell on them. And then he applies it to Job. Chapter 8, verses 6 and 7. If you will seek God and make supplication to the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, surely then He'll rouse Himself for you and reward you with a rightful habitation. In other words, the reason this is dragging on the way it is because there's some hidden sin in your life, Job. If you just repent the way you ought to repent, God would rise up, deliver you. Now Job is getting tired of this party line. He knows this. He thinks this big sin, big suffering, big righteousness, big prosperity, he thinks that little simple way of viewing life is just naive. So in chapter 9, let's let him have a word here. chapter 9, verses 22 to 24. He thinks this is all out of sync with reality. It is all one. Therefore I say, God destroys both the blameless and the wicked. In other words, I don't buy your principle. God destroys the blameless. God destroys the wicked. When disaster brings sudden death, He mocks at calamity of the innocent. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covers the faces of its judges. If it is not He, who then is it? The wicked prosper. The wicked prosper. And the innocent get killed. God's behind it all. Don't tell me your little simple principle of big sin, big pain, big righteousness, big prosperity. It doesn't work. All right? Chapter 10, verses 6 and 7. Thou dost seek out my iniquity and search for my sin. Although thou knowest I am not guilty. So there for the second time, he's protesting his innocence. Now I'm going to admit something here. I think Job, before he's done, is going to be pushed so hard, he's going to begin to overstate his own condition. And that's why, in the end, there's going to be some rebuke from God. Job started as a good man. He wasn't punished for his sin. But as he's pressed and pressed, the remnants of the sin that we all had begin to come up. And it's difficult to discern just where Job crosses the line, but I think he will. Whether he does here or not, I'm not sure. Verses 6 and 7 of chapter 10, thou dost seek out my iniquity, search for my sin. Oh, you know I'm not guilty. I don't think he's wrong to say that at this point. The way they're talking, you must have some big hidden sin in your life for this thing to drag on the way it is. Your kids must have had some big sin in their life for that to happen to them. I think it's right for Job to say, you search my life. I'm not what you think I am. Now Zophar, third person in this first cycle, he becomes even more harsh. Chapter 11. Zophar gets a word. He doesn't like Job's rebuke of claiming to be innocent. And so in verses 14, 15, he says, if iniquity is in your hand, put it away. Let not wickedness dwell in your tents. Surely then you will lift up your face without blemish. You will be secure and will not fear. So he challenges him. Okay, you say you're innocent, lift it up, and you'll be vindicated by God. So that's what Zophar has to contribute. Now Job, in his response to Zophar, resorts to sarcasm. In verse 3, you see it in chapter 12. These are all commonplaces. Everybody knows what you're saying. Everybody's heard these things. You see that at the end of verse 3. Your maxims, your proverbs are ashes, verse 12 and 13. Worthless physicians are you all, chapter 13, verse 4. And then, I want God to talk to. I don't want to talk to you. I want to take up my case with God. Chapter 13, verse 3, he says, I would speak to the Almighty and desire to argue my case with God. In other words, I'm not getting anywhere with you. Your principles are not working. They're so out of touch with reality. God, I'll enter into a courtroom with God and lay my case before Him. Chapter 13, verse 3. And that's the end of cycle 1. It's the long cycle because they are getting all their stuff out on the table now, and Job is responding. And what happens now in the remaining 2 cycles is that they get harsher and less credible as they go along. So let's make short work of these 2 cycles. Cycle 2, I'll just let each of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar have one word. Chapter 15, verse 20. Let's hear the principle again from Eliphaz. 15:20. He says, it is the wicked man that writhes in pain. So there it is. The wicked man that writhes in pain. Chapter 15, verse 20. Now how does it sound in the mouth of Bildad? Chapter 18, verse 5. It is the light of the wicked that is put out. That's the way Bildad says it. So if your light's being put out, if you're writhing in pain, it's wickedness. And that's the explanation. How does Zophar say it in chapter 20, verse 5? Zophar. The joy of the wicked is short. So it's the same refrain all through this second cycle. The principle, these guys are not bringing anything new to the table. What about cycle 3? Well, the last speech of Eliphaz, chapter 22, is brutal. So they've just lost all patience with Job. They've lost all sensitivity. Their wooden theology that isn't big enough to cope with the ambiguities that Job sees in life is going to be hammered on this guy. So let me read you that I think we'll start at verse 5 of chapter 22. Is not your wickedness great? So no questions anymore. He's just nailing him. Is not your wickedness great? There is no end to your iniquities. For you have exacted pledges of your brothers for nothing, and stripped the naked of their clothing. You have given no water to the weary, and you have withheld bread from the hungry. You have sent widows away empty, and the arms of the fatherless were crushed. There's not a shred of truth in that. That's a lie. He has lost contact with reality because of a theology that can't hold in the presence of reality. His theology can't handle Job. And therefore he distorts Job. When you got a distorted theology, you're going to hurt people. You're going to distort people. The only way you can handle reality to make it fit your bad theology is to distort reality to fit it in there. So he makes a wicked man out of this man, Job. And we know from Job's testimony and God's testimony. God says this man was blameless. Don't forget verses 1 to 3 of chapter 1. God says there's nobody like this man in the East. This is a lie. Verses 5 following in chapter 22 is a lie. It is so preposterous that Bildad can barely make a 6-verse contribution in his last cycle as he gets a chance to talk, and Zophar says nothing. You know, they've listened to Eliphaz say what he just says about Job, and they say, whoa, what more can I say? That's heavy. I think they're real nervous inside. This is probably a little too much, what he just said there. So if you ask now structurally, the way the book is built, we have 3 speeches and 3 responses, 3 more shorter speeches, more brutal speeches, and 3 responses. And then the most brutal speech of all from Eliphaz, a little teeny one to contribute from Bildad and Zophar. He's gone. So the structure breaks down. I think that is a poetic or structural way of saying the theology breaks down. The theology of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar breaks down in the end. It started symmetrically. There was some balance in Eliphaz's first speech. There was some symmetry to it. There was some sensitivity to it, some gentleness to it, some querying to it. And it gets more and more brittle, more and more wooden, less and less in touch with reality. And then structurally, they can't even complete the cycle, as it were. So the main point of those 29 chapters, I think, is the principle big sin correlating with big pain and big righteousness correlating with big prosperity won't hold in life. It won't hold in life.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Light and Truth, where we are committed to providing God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. On our next episode, John Piper continues our 11-part series, Holding Fast to God in the Dark, with a message titled, Holding Fast Through False Judgment. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.